We're going to talk now about the backstory to masking. And if I could just start with you, Kieran, when did we first start talking about masking, do you think?
Oh, um, masking in itself, we've been talking about it for quite a lot of years now, over a century, when it's applied to different marginalized groups. It's been something that human beings have been aware of as a psychological concept for a long, long time. The first real kind of famous discussion about it was from William Dubois, who was a psychologist in the United States, a sociologist, sorry, in the United States, who was looking at the experiences of Black people who face racial oppression. And he talked about the double consciousness. Which is, through his words, kind of that Black people needed to appear more white around white people, so changing the way that they spoke, suppressing their cultural kind of behaviors, and all of those kind of things to be more acceptable to white people. And what that did was cause like a schism in their psyche. So they had this outward projected version that was more white, and underneath they had their more authentic, culturally authentic person that was underneath, the Black person that was underneath. So, and then they carried that around with them all the time. So that was the constant battle between these two different cells within their body. But talking about masking amongst autistic people, really, you need to go back to the late 80s and early 90s, where autistic people who were coming out and writing at that point, and also some psychologists, people like Judith Gould and Lorna Wing, made discussions about these kind of things, and not necessarily using this terminology, but really started to explain their experiences. And Amy's going to jump in and say the first autistic person to use it write about this in a book was Gunilla Gerlund, who's from Sweden. But there is a more famous book, and Amy's going to jump in and tell me the author of that famous book. Go on, Amy. That's the one.
That is Leanne Holiday Willie in the book Pretending to be Normal. So that's usually where this kind of classic or more archetypal view of masking is said to kind of originate. And in the autism research literature, discussions around masking in and of itself didn't come about until around 2015, 2016. So Damien Milton and Tara Sims wrote about masking amongst the autistic community in some research that they had done. But this wasn't really picked up by psychologists. We are notoriously siloed, don't read a lot outside of our areas often. And at the same time that some research was starting to emerge in psychology, it was also going on in sociology, spearheaded by autistic scholars. But we kind of tend to attribute the first discussions of masking in the psychological literature to Sarah Bargila and Will Manby. So followed very quickly by Judith Gould in 2017. But yeah, Sarah Bargila's PhD work looking at the experiences of late diagnosed autistic women was really one of the first pieces of literature in psychology to start unpacking this experience of masking and suppressing aspects of self. And that was discussed in regards to being late diagnosed. So people not picking up on you being autistic because you are actively trying to kind of hide bits of yourself, which is intentionally or unintentionally leading people to not being identified as autistic.
Just to jump back in there as well, this is something that the autistic community, like many things that happen within the autistic community, we've been talking about this for 30, 40, 50 years. These are the narratives that are being described in research now have been discussions that go back decades. So, and it's a really prime example of, firstly, how, the group being researched isn't actually being listened to at all. And that non-autistic people haven't picked up these narratives, despite the fact that autistic people have been shouting about them for a very, very long time. So it just goes to show how far research is behind the community that they're actually pronouncing themselves as experts over.
Yeah, and public knowledge as well is so far behind, and it's not until we start listening to the autistic community that we learn and understand things like this. Do you think it's important that we've finally starting to catch up there and it is being talked about publicly?
Yes. Fundamentally, yes. if I think about the experiences that I had at school, autistic children, despite the fact that we have had all these awareness campaigns and the public are more consciously aware of autistic people, although that comes with all the myths and stigma and things like that, that actually nothing really fundamentally has changed, because autistic children now are having exactly the same experiences as autistic children had 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. So it's so important that this narrative is firstly within academia, because what happens in academia, society follows kind of 10 years, 20 years later, further down the line. So we need academia to be looking at these things in order for it to soak out into the media, into culture, and into society. But secondly, on top of that, we need academia to be getting these narratives right. Otherwise, it creates whole new levels of stigma and myth. And we're probably going to talk about that in a bit. And I know Amy and I and Jodie are very passionate about this, getting this right, that those misconceptions around masking are already out there in the mainstream narrative, in schools, in professional kind of understanding, and so on and so forth. So that already we're having to, even though it's a very new academic narrative, we're already having to unpick it because it's going in very, very misconceptualized and misperceived directions.
Probably emphasize what Kieran said, but the question about is it important that we're talking about this stuff? Masking in particular, I get several emails a day from families who are desperately trying to get their child the support that they need to recover their child from burnout, to get their child accurately identified. And masking is a massive hindrance to that, with the lack of understanding that's within schools, the lack of understanding that's within GP surgeries. They're the gatekeepers to identification, and referrals of these children for assessments are constantly being batted back because a lot of the criteria is now that the child has to present as autistic in more than one setting. If you've got a child that's masking in school, masking at Brownie Group, masking at Scouts, masking at wherever they're going, and only ever presenting at home, has massive implications on getting that child supported. And then there's a whole other topic that leads on from that around parent blame, which we probably don't have time to go into right now. But we have to be talking about masking. We have to be doing the research. We have to be getting the information into mainstream environments, to those gatekeepers, because quite literally children's lives depend on it. It's massive.
Thank you. Amy, you wanted to add something to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, so recently I supervised a student on a project, and they were a medical student, and they chose to focus on masking as their topic of this dissertation that they were writing. And it was really refreshing to see someone from a completely different field who usually wouldn't pick up on any of this information. It might be taught in psychology degrees, but not necessarily in a medical degree. And they'd gone off and done this reading on their own, and then thought about how they could communicate this to other people who were training to be GPs. So they did a presentation to their cohort all about kind of the myths and misconceptions around autism, and how masking might impact that, drawing upon a variety of literature, kind of not taking this very stereotyped approach. And I thought it really gave me hope for the future, that if we're seeing people who are currently training taking up the mantle and kind of sharing this information on their own, it's hopefully going to have a really positive impact in the future.
Kieran?
Of victim blaming that's been going on for a very, very, very long time and continues to perpetuate. So talking about this is absolutely vital, because I fundamentally believe that masking is at the heart of the autism narrative, that it is the intersectional core of everything that is related to autism, because how we are treated as human beings, or how we are dehumanized as human beings, and how we are not treated as human beings, is right at the very heart of who we are as autistic people, and it's what impacts most on our identity. And that's really what we're talking about here. We're talking about stigma, marginalization, dehumanization, trauma. This is really fundamentally what we're speaking about here, and those are things that are given to us. They're not things that exist within us. They're not things that we are born with. These are things that are handed to us, again, by a society that deems itself inclusive but isn't at all. It gatekeeps access to it, and that's, we need to change all these narratives, but also we need to look at, going to what Jodie said around experiences within schools and the lack of recognition from professionals who think they know lots about autism because they've had autism training, but that autism training is poor and stereotyped and, full of tropes, and doesn't really give anyone any productive, useful information about what it means to be autistic, because usually it's written and delivered by people who aren't autistic and do not understand this from the inside out. It's all based on observation. So within schools, we have narratives like social skills and things like that, which actually just condition us to mask more. So, there's massive misconceptions and there's massive mistakes happening right now. As we're talking right now, children are being put this. Adults are harming themselves and hurting themselves because of these narratives. And that's why it fundamentally has to shift, because we're talking about human beings and their lives and the negative lives that most of us lead, or the majority of us lead, because of these narratives that don't have to happen.
Yeah, you did a campaign a few years back. Is that why, Kieran?
Yeah. If I were to do it again, I would do it very differently, because I think that some of the narratives that came off weren't advertised strongly enough. It was called Taking the Mask Off, and the name within itself was a little confusing and misleading, because you can't just take your mask off. It was a play on words. It was taking the mask off of autistic masking. That was the kind of narrative behind it. But there are many people who can't be authentic as much as they would like to be and as much as they can try to be, because of their multiply marginalized backgrounds. So people of color, people who are queer, people who are visibly autistic, that are treated negatively because they are more visibly autistic. So there are certain groups of people for whom masking actually is paradoxically saving their lives whilst also harming them. And they don't have any choice in that. So as a white middle effectively kind of late working class, lower middle class working man, I have a lot of privilege in order to be able to say that, I can make safe spaces for myself and I can do certain things in order to minimize my masking. But other people don't have those choices. So yes, that was me going on a bit of a segue there, but yeah, so that's fundamentally why we did it, though, and it had a reach of millions, reached people all over the planet. The Northeast Society, Autism Society, supported it, and lots of non-performative organisations supported it as well, and really took it on board. But unfortunately, even there, it has been mentioned in academia, but it's also been mentioned as a kind of, it was a thing that happened on Twitter, as a dismissive thing. So I think there needs to be more recognition from academia, certainly, about academic privilege and actually the weight that the academic voice carries in order to change this narrative and really kind of do that. And if I were to do it again, I would do it very differently, but I would want academia to actually sit up and take part in it, rather than just looking at it from the outside and then dismissing it as a bit of a social media campaign, which is what it wasn't.
Just wanted to follow on with Kieran's mention of it not being safe to unmask, and I think that's a really, really important point that is often neglected, because we talk a lot about masking, and the negative consequences, but it's not safe to unmask. It's not always safe to be your authentic self. You put yourself in really risky positions at times, and that comes in all sorts of dimensions. But I think particularly for me, coming in at this from a parent of autistic children, an autistic parent of autistic children, but also supporting other parents of autistic children, is that the systems that sit around keeping our children safe, and the systems that sit around protecting our children's mental health or supporting our children's mental health, still don't understand autistic experience. So I'll just give a personal example. My child had a social care assessment recently for their EHCP, and I had a social worker in the house who was actually, you know, she was fantastic, really taking on board a lot of what I said. I did very diplomatically challenge a few things, but towards the end she asked to see my child's bedroom with his permission and with my permission, and you know, by this point I felt relatively comfortable with her. So I said, yeah, you know, as long as he's fine with that, that's fine. And she said, oh, I know it's a bit awkward, it's just a tick boxing, really, we just have to check that he's got a bed. And I said, well, actually, he does have a bed, but it's actually particularly common for neurodivergent people to sleep on the floor. It's grounding, and I know Christy Forbes has done a brilliant piece on this on her Facebook page. My middle child quite often sleeps not only on the floor but actually under her bed. If you came in and saw a bed set up under a bed, you would have a particular view about that. I felt really confident and able to unmask in that situation and be really authentic. Actually, yeah, he has a bed, but for us, sleeping on the floor isn't a sign of bad parenting. A lot of parents wouldn't be able to do that. A lot of parents would be in a position where if their child was sleeping on the floor, they would immediately be deemed unfit as parents. And there's loads of examples of this. You know, one of my children doesn't manage clothing. So even in the winter, they will wear minimal clothing, and actually all last winter a pair of sandals, unbrushed hair. My youngest child is my most probably authentic because we've known that he's autistic from a very young age. He's not been put into the school system. That's who he is. But I have to be really careful as to where he's seen. If I take him to certain appointments, I have to be really aware that actually if I take him to an appointment in the middle of December with a pair of sandals on and a pair of pajama shorts and t-shirt that's not always the cleanest, that's going to be judged in a very different way to how it actually is. And that's just one sort of small example of how it's not always safe to be authentic. You know, there's loads. As Luke Bearden talks about an example of a young person that was being very authentically themselves, I think during a meltdown, and then got sectioned. Because there was this, you know, there's that massive misunderstanding.
I was going to say, you're talking about misconceptions around autism there. You've also mentioned misconceptions about masking. I think Kieran mentioned it as well. What misconceptions do you think there are around masking?
Anecdotally, I hear parents are told that their child can't be masking because they're a boy. They can't. There's no way that they could mask all day. There's no way that they could seem that happy and not be okay. I don't know. Kieran and Amy could probably add loads more around this. That it's choice. You know, worked with lots of children, still working with lots of children who, within certain environments, are deemed manipulative. And if you are faced with what you believe to be a manipulative child, all you're going to do in that circumstances is push that a little bit harder, challenge them a little bit harder, and it's really damaging. And it's a really horrible thing to be accused of. Like, I'm always talking about, actually, they're not being manipulative, they're keeping themselves safe. There's a massive difference. And again, it's about shifting those narratives.
And do you ever find if people are masking all day and then when they get home, you know, they might go into meltdown or have, you know, and it's only their parents that see that? Are the parents ever accused of making things up or exaggerating?
Oh, all the time. I mean, autistic parents are at massive risk of parent blame and FII, fabricated induced illness. You know, and there's research on it. There's Fiona Gullen-Scott has done some brilliant research on the risk of FII. I covered it in one of my assignments. And actually, what was massively frightening and shocking for me is when I read the NICE guidelines on fabricated and induced illness, it could very easily describe an autistic child that's masking. You know, it's talk about the symptoms only present around the parent. just trying to think of some of the others off the top of my head. It was a while ago I did that. The parent being more knowledgeable than the professional. Well, you know, without sounding big-headed, I fall into that category quite easily. And when I'm really ranting about my own children, I quite often say that to the professionals that are coming into my home and assessing my children. But equally, you know, autistic parents, we like to do our research. So we do go out there and seek answers and problem solve and join the dots. And we're very, you know, we can be very in tune and instinctive with our children. So, you know, we can, you know, we are we're really passionate about our children, so we can come across as being quite insistent. But I mean, mainly that's because we have to be shouting loud in order to be heard. And again, that's misjudged.
Thank you. Kieran or Amy, is there anything you want to add about misconceptions about masking?
I'll jump in here quickly. I think one of the misconceptions that really annoys me, and I know it annoys Kieran as well quite a bit, is the idea that autistic people who have co-occurring learning disabilities or higher support needs don't mask. That if you are always more obviously autistic to other people, that you can't mask and that isn't something that you'd experience. And it's very much not the case. We know that a lot of people in particular who've experienced things like forms of behavioural therapy that are focused on minimizing autistic behaviors, what they're doing is teaching people to mask. So you often have people who have been taught to mask, and then we're saying, those people don't, and it makes absolutely no sense. All it does is kind of seek to cause a bit of a discrepancy between what are perceived to be higher functioning people or perceived to be lower functioning people, these really arbitrary, harmful labels, and kind of offensive terminology that's used to minimize the experiences of distress, regardless of how your autism looks or manifests to other people. So I think that's one of my huge bugbears, and everything that Jodie mentioned was spot on. So things like gender, it's really infuriating.
Kieran, is there anything you'd like to add?
That's not due to anything that they're doing differently. It's just around our ideas around kind of social development and stuff like that. There's a lot of stuff underpinning that. But the other thing is what Amy said around kind of that there's this idea that certain groups mask or that only a certain type of autistic person masks, and really that's tied into the misunderstandings and misconceptions around functioning. Around there's firstly a narrative that it's only high functioning, and I use that term in inverted commas because it's not a real term and it actually has no meaning, but only that high functioning autistic people mask. So that's autistic people that speak, and autistic people who are deemed to be intelligent, or have a certain level of intelligence. But also there's been the exclusion of other autistic people, who people think, because of this idea that masking is only about hiding, when in actual fact this notion of this exaggerated personality and meeting people's expectations, when somebody has an expectation that they're going to be treated negatively because that's their previous experience, sometimes all they can do is play into that negativity. Sometimes that might mean being the class clown, sometimes that might mean presenting with challenging behavior, because that's the expectation of how people will see you, because that's their previous experience of you. So you play into that, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So we really need to kind of pick apart this narrative that, and the name masking is when itself is a kind of a misnomer, because it isn't all about covering up. Sometimes it is about exaggerating, but in a professional narrative, that part of that narrative wouldn't even be recognized as even existing. So there's so much more work that needs to be done. And what Jodie said about the FII kind of narrative there, and what's in the NICE guidelines about parents having more knowledge than professionals. I'm really sorry to most professionals out there, and this is a hashtag not all professionals moment, but there are many autistic people out there who have a far greater knowledge of autism than you do as professionals. And that can be a really difficult thing for you to hear, because you are taught to be the experts, and I use that word loosely. You are taught that you are the ones that have to have the knowledge and are providing the help for other people, but sometimes that help actually harms. And that's because you are not supported well enough to have a great enough understanding, but you are told you have a great enough understanding. So there's a lot of narratives there that need to be unpicked, and a lot of it starts with actually professionals recognizing that they're not the authority. They are from the outside looking in, and so they need to listen, they need to understand, and they need to work collaboratively with us. There needs to be mutuality, and there isn't at the moment. There's a hierarchy of power, and unfortunately they're at the top and we're at the bottom of it.
Thank you. So even though we've started talking about masking, there's a long, long way to go, and we need to listen more to the autistic community.